deep in the fog, choked hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains rise like ancient sentinels, guarding secrets long forgotten. A traveling physician by the name of Dr. Samuel Harrington stumbled onto something that would ultimately expose one of America's darkest family histories. It was autumn, and the hillsides were painted in rust and amber when he came across an abandoned cabin near Harlan County. Beneath rotting floorboards, buried under years of accumulated dust, he discovered a leather-bound journal that once belonged to Patsey Troxdale, a young woman who had lived and suffered in total isolation from the outside world. The Troxdale family had made their home in these remote mountains since 1790, settling in a valley so secluded that neighboring communities barely acknowledged their existence. For more than 5 generations, they remained entirely cut off from society, building their own insular world where bloodlines grew tangled like wild vines, overtaking their property. The family patriarch, Patsey Troxdale, had laid down strict rules. No outsider could marry into the family, no member could leave the valley, and family bonds were to stay unbroken at any cost. By 1912, the devastating consequences of those rules had become painfully clear. Patsey Troxdale was 19 when she began writing in her diary, though her appearance suggested someone far older. Her words, written in shaky handwriting that grew more erratic with each entry, painted a portrait of a community tearing itself apart from within. Dr. Harrington, a man of science from Boston who had committed his career to serving rural Appalachia, immediately recognized the medical significance of what he held. The diary described, in agonizing detail, the physical conditions afflicting nearly every member of the Troxdale clan. Patsey wrote about her cousin brother Marcus, whose twisted spine forced him to walk bent nearly in half. She described her aunt-mother, Eliza, whose uncontrollable shaking had started in her teen years and never stopped. She chronicled the deaths of multiple infants born, with conditions she couldn't name, but described with heartbreaking clarity. The first entry that seized Dr. Harrington's attention was dated March 5, 1911. "Mama says I'm to wed Uncle Vernon come spring," Patsey wrote. "His daddy's brother and also Mama's cousin. I asked why we can't bring someone from the town below, but Daddy struck me hard and said Troxdales only marry Troxdales. That's how it's always been." The doctor's hands trembled as he turned the yellowed pages. The diary revealed Patsey herself was the product of a union between first cousins who were also second cousins through another branch. Her parents shared the same grandfather and the same great-grandmother through different lines. The genetic consequences were written across her body in ways 19th century medicine was just beginning to comprehend. Patsey described her own afflictions with a matter of fact tone that made them even more unsettling. Her teeth had grown in overlapping patterns, causing constant pain and making eating difficult. Her left eye wandered independently of her right, giving her perpetual headaches and limited vision. Her joints ached constantly, and by age 16, she had already lost several teeth. But it was her mind that worried her most. She wrote about moments of confusion, times when she couldn't recall her own name, instances where she would find herself in the forest, with no memory of getting there. The Troxdale compound consisted of 7 structures scattered across a narrow valley. Approximately 43 people lived there in 1912, though Patsey's diary suggested that number fluctuated as infants died with disturbing regularity and elderly members succumbed to conditions that seemed to accelerate aging. Every single resident was related by blood, most through multiple lines of descent. Dr. Harrington pieced together the family's history from Patsey's entries. The isolation had started innocently enough. Jedediah Troxdale moved his family into the mountains to escape what he called civilization's corrupting influence. But somewhere in the second generation, practical necessity gave way to something darker. When his sons reached marrying age, Jedidiah refused to let them seek wives from neighboring communities. Instead, he arranged unions between his children, justifying it with twisted biblical interpretations and claims about preserving family purity. By the third generation, the pattern was irreversible. The Troxdales had become so genetically entangled that they couldn't recognize the damage they were perpetuating. Brothers married sisters, uncles wed nieces, first cousins paired off as routinely as unrelated couples might in the outside world. And with each generation, the physical and mental consequences compounded. Patty's diary entry from July 19, 1911, revealed the full horror of her situation. Baby Ruth was born last night. She came out wrong, all twisted up like a rag someone wrung dry. Lived maybe an hour. Mama buried her behind the cabin before dawn. That makes 6 babies in 2 years that didn't make it. Daddy says it's God's will. But I see how Mama looks at the ground when she thinks nobody's watching. The most chilling aspect wasn't the physical descriptions, but Patty's growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with her family. Unlike older Troxdales, who accepted their circumstances as normal, Patty had somehow developed a critical perspective. Perhaps it was because she once glimpsed a traveling preacher who wandered into their valley by accident. Perhaps it was because she found old newspapers that blew in from neighboring counties. Whatever the reason, Patty knew her family was different, and she knew that difference was destroying them. Dr. Harrington read late into the night, unable to stop despite the mounting horror. He read about William Troxdale, who at 28 had the mental capacity of a young child. He read about Sarah Troxdale, whose seizures came so frequently that she spent most days restrained to prevent injury. He read about the twins, Jacob and Joseph, born joined at the hip and separated by their grandfather with a heated blade and whiskey as anesthetic. Joseph died within days. Jacob lived, but his screams echoed through the valley for weeks. Because what you're about to discover goes deeper than any history book dared to print, and these hidden bloodlines won't stay buried forever. Dr. Harrington closed the diary as dawn light filtered through the broken cabin windows. His medical training had exposed him to countless human sufferings, but nothing prepared him for the systematic genetic catastrophe documented in Patty's words. He needed to find out what happened to the Troxdales, to understand whether any survived, and to learn Patty's fate. The nearest town, Harland, sat 15 miles northwest through treacherous mountain paths. When Dr. Harrington arrived with the diary, the local sheriff, a weathered man named Clayton Burke, listened to his account with growing unease. Sheriff Burke had lived in these mountains his entire 53 years and knew the stories whispered about Troxdale Valley, though he always dismissed them as mountain superstition. Together they assembled a small expedition: Dr. Harrington, Sheriff Burke, a deputy named Thomas Webb, and a local guide named Abraham Cole, who claimed to know the way to the Troxdale compound. As they climbed into higher elevations, Abraham shared what he knew. The Troxdales had traded with a general store in a tiny settlement called Gray's Knob until about 1900. After that, they stopped coming down from the mountains entirely. Rumors circulated about why. Some said they all died from a fever. Others claimed they moved west. A few whispered darker theories about what happened when families married too close for too long. The journey took 2 days. The terrain grew increasingly hostile as they ascended, with paths seemingly designed to discourage visitors. On the afternoon of the second day, they found the valley Patty described. 7 structures remained standing, though time and weather had reduced them to skeletal frames. The expedition approached cautiously, calling out to announce their presence. but only silence answered. What they discovered in that valley haunted them for the rest of their lives. The Troxdale compound stood as a monument to genetic catastrophe. In the main cabin, they found remains suggesting the family continued living there until at least 1910, just 2 years prior, but the evidence indicated their final years marked rapid decline. Dr. Harrington documented everything with clinical precision, though his journal entries reveal how deeply the scene affected him. In one cabin, they found the skeleton of what appeared to be an adult male, but the bone structure showed severe abnormalities. The spine curved at impossible angles. The skull displayed unusual thickness in some areas and disturbing thinness in others. The leg bones were different lengths, suggesting years of painful, uneven walking. In another structure, they discovered what might have been a makeshift medical area. Rough shelves held jars containing preserved specimens, though whether these were attempts at medical study or something darker remained unclear. The expedition found infant remains preserved in alcohol, each showing different developmental abnormalities. The Troxdales had apparently documented their own genetic decline, though whether they understood what they were seeing remains unknown. Sheriff Burke found a family Bible in the main cabin, and its pages told a genealogical story confirming Patty's diary entries. The family tree didn't branch. It tangled back on itself like a snake eating its tail. Names appeared multiple times across different generations. The same individuals served as both parents and grandparents to the same children. The connections grew so convoluted that tracing any single line became nearly impossible. Thomas Webb discovered something suggesting the Troxdales finally recognized their situation's hopelessness. In a cleared area behind the main cabin, they found a cemetery containing 47 marked graves. The dates suggested an acceleration of deaths beginning around 1900. Infant graves clustered together in heartbreaking numbers, but the most disturbing discovery was a series of graves from 1911 and 1912. The years of Patty's diary, showing the family's final members, died in rapid succession. Abraham Cole, the mountain guide, found evidence that other mountain communities knew about the Troxdales and deliberately avoided them. He discovered markers along the paths, old symbols carved into trees serving as warnings to travelers. The Troxdales became Appalachian bogeymen, a cautionary tale used to frighten children and reinforce the importance of seeking marriage partners outside one's immediate community. As Dr. Harrington continued reading Patty's diary against the backdrop of the abandoned compound, the written words took on new dimensions. Her entry from October 3, 1911, described a community meeting where the eldest Troxdale, a man named Ezekiel, who was uncle, brother, and grandfather to various family members, finally acknowledged their children were born weaker with each generation. But even then he refused to allow outsiders into the family, claiming God was testing their faith. Patty wrote about arguments turning violent. She described how her brother-cousin Samuel tried to leave the valley to find a wife in Harland, only to be dragged back by uncles and confined to a root cellar for weeks. When they finally released him, his spirit was broken, and he married his own sister-niece in a ceremony Patty described as more funeral than wedding. The diary revealed Patty herself had been promised to multiple male relatives before finally being assigned to Uncle Vernon. She wrote about her wedding night with devastating honesty, describing her fear, her pain, and her growing certainty she was participating in something fundamentally wrong. Within 3 months, she was pregnant. Within 6 months, she miscarried a child she described as not properly formed. Dr. Harrington found entries showing Patty tried to convince others to leave the valley. She pleaded with younger Troxdales to run away, find lives beyond the mountains, break the cycle consuming them. But the older generation maintained iron control, and those who questioned family ways were punished severely. Patey described beatings, long periods of confinement, and psychological manipulation, convincing family members the outside world was dangerous and corrupt. The most heartbreaking entries came from late 1911, when Patey began losing hope. She wrote about watching her cousin's sister Martha die during childbirth at age 17. She described helping bury another malformed infant. The 12th that year, she chronicled her own deteriorating health, increasing confusion. Episodes where she couldn't remember entire days, painful swelling in her joints that made walking difficult. But Patey's final entries, written in early 1912, revealed something unexpected. She found an ally in her grandmother, Aunt Rebecca, an elderly woman who lived long enough to see 4 generations of genetic decline. Rebecca secretly taught Patey about herbs and remedies, but more importantly, encouraged Patey to document everything in her diary. Rebecca knew the Troxdale line was ending and wanted someone someday to understand what happened in that isolated valley. The diary entries from February 1912 marked a turning point in Patey's understanding. "Grandmother Rebecca told me today that we are cursed," she wrote, "but not by God or the devil. She says we cursed ourselves. She showed me her hands twisted like tree roots and said her mother's hands looked normal. She showed me her brother husband's grave and told me he was the first one born with the shaking sickness. She said every generation we get weaker. Every generation more babies die. Every generation the pain gets worse. And she said it's because we keep marrying our own blood." Harrington shared this entry with Sheriff Burke, who sat in silence several minutes before speaking. Clayton Burke wasn't educated in the formal sense, but decades of mountain living gave him practical wisdom that recognized truth when he heard it. He told Dr. Harrington about other isolated families in Appalachia, communities where similar patterns emerged, though rarely to the extent seen in Troxdale Valley. The expedition spent 3 days documenting the compound. Dr. Harrington took measurements, made sketches, and collected remaining records. He found evidence multiple physicians had visited the valley over the years, though their recommendations to bring in outside bloodlines were violently rejected. One doctor's journal, discovered in a trunk, described being threatened with weapons and escorted out after suggesting the Troxdales marry beyond their family circle. Thomas Webb found Patey's cabin identifiable by details she described in her diary. It was smaller than others, set slightly apart from the main compound. Inside, they discovered more evidence of her final month's letters she wrote, but never sent, addressed to authorities in Harlan begging for help, drawings showing family trees with marginal notes documenting physical afflictions associated with specific lineages, a small box containing locks of hair from babies who hadn't survived, each labeled with name and date. But the most significant discovery came when Abraham Cole noticed disturbed earth near the tree line. Digging carefully, they uncovered a metal box containing additional journals. These ones written by Rebecca Troxdale. The elderly woman had documented the family's decline for decades, creating a record that complemented Patey's diary. Rebecca's entries were less emotional but more comprehensive, listing every birth, death, marriage, and physical abnormality manifesting across 4 generations. Rebecca's journals revealed she tried convincing family patriarchs to change their ways as early as 1890. She witnessed her own children suffer, watched grandchildren born with increasing problems, and saw great-grandchildren fail to thrive. Her final entry, dated November 1911, expressed certainty the Troxdale line would end within a generation, perhaps within years. "We have bred ourselves into a corner from which there is no escape," she wrote. "The damage is written into our very bones now. Dr. Harrington, Cross, reference Patey's diary with Rebecca's journals, creating a comprehensive picture of the Troxdale family's final years. The pattern was undeniable. In 1860, the family numbered over 80 individuals spread across the valley. By 1900, they declined to 53. By 1910, only 31 remained, and the physical conditions affecting them grew progressively worse each year. The doctor identified multiple genetic disorders, compounding across generations. Skeletal abnormalities appeared in nearly every family member after 1890. Neurological conditions, including seizures, tremors, and cognitive impairment, became increasingly common. Infant mortality rates exceeded 70% by 1900. Of babies surviving birth, fewer than half lived past their 5th year. Patey's diary entry from March 1912 provided devastating insight into the family's final collapse. She described a winter killing 6 people, including Uncle Vernon, her husband of less than a year. She wrote about remaining Troxdales gathering to discuss options. Some wanted to continue as always, trusting Providence. Others, led by Rebecca, argued they needed to open the family to outsiders or face extinction. The argument turned violent. Patey described men fighting in the snow, old grudges erupting into physical confrontation. She wrote about women screaming, children crying, the community fragmenting before her eyes. The meeting ended with the family fractured into factions, each occupying different cabins, barely speaking. And now here, in this exact moment, I need you to understand something Patey wrote in her final pages. Something applying not just to them, but to anyone who's ever kept dark secrets hidden in isolated places. Patey said, "Silence protects no one. Truth, no matter how painful, is the only medicine that heals." If those words resonate with you, if you believe hidden histories must be brought to light, leave a comment right now saying, "Silence protects no one." So I know you're truly paying attention to what we're uncovering here. Patey's final diary entries were written in April 1912, documenting the complete collapse of the Troxdale community. Her handwriting had deteriorated significantly, suggesting her own physical and mental condition declined rapidly. Yet her observations remained sharp, recording details proving invaluable for understanding what happened in that isolated valley. She wrote about the spring thaw revealing graves dug in frozen ground, about discovering food stores insufficient for remaining family members, about realizing too few healthy adults remained to maintain the compound. The Troxdales, who survived in isolation over a century, finally reached a point where their genetic damage made simple survival impossible. Dr. Harrington found evidence supporting Patey's accounts throughout the compound. Root cellars contained spoiled provisions, suggesting inadequate preservation knowledge among remaining members. Fields showed signs of poor planting, seeds scattered randomly rather than in proper rows. Livestock areas stood empty, indicating animals either died or wandered away. The infrastructure sustaining generations crumbled as people capable of maintaining it succumbed to accumulated genetic burden. Patey's entry from April 12, 1912 described a final family meeting. Only 14 Troxdales remained alive, 8 adults and 6 children. Among adults, only 3 were mentally and physically capable of functioning independently. The others required constant care, suffering conditions ranging from severe cognitive impairment to physical disabilities so profound they couldn't perform basic self-care. Rebecca Troxdale, now 84 and suffering accumulated effects from a lifetime of inbreeding, made a final speech Patey recorded in detail. The old woman acknowledged the family's mistakes, accepted responsibility for perpetuating practices she knew were harmful, and released remaining Troxdales from any obligation to stay. She gave permission for anyone who could leave to seek lives elsewhere. Marry outside the family, break the cycle. But by then, leaving the mountains was impossible for most. Severe skeletal deformities prevented long-distance travel. Cognitive impairments made navigating the outside world unthinkable. Generations of isolation left them without social skills or knowledge necessary for integrating into normal society. Patey wrote that she and two cousins, Joshua and Mary, were the only ones physically capable of attempting the Harlan journey. But Mary refused to leave her young children, too sick to travel. Joshua, despite only 26, suffered joint problems so severe he could barely walk. That left Patey as perhaps the only Troxdale with both physical capacity and mental determination to escape. Her final entries described her preparations. She gathered what few valuables remained, small amounts of money saved from their last trading visits to Gray's Knob, some silver items passed down from original Jetty Troxdale, documents she hoped would help establish her identity. She wrote letters to be left behind, explaining what happened and asking someone to come help those remaining. But Patey's last diary entry, dated April 26, 1912, revealed a heartbreaking decision. I prepared to leave today, had everything ready, walked to the valley entrance. But I looked back and saw the cabins, saw the smoke from the fires, thought about grandmother Rebecca and cousin Mary and the children. I thought about how they will die alone if I leave, how there will be no one to bury them, proper or say words over their graves. And I knew I cannot go, cannot leave them. This valley is my curse and my duty. I will stay until the end. The entry concluded with a final paragraph. Dr. Harrington read aloud to the others. I hide this diary under the floorboards of my cabin. Someday someone will find it. They will read about us. They will know what we did to ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, it will stop some other family from making the same mistakes we made. We thought we were staying pure, but we were just destroying ourselves generation by generation until nothing remained but pain and sorrow and regret. To Dr. Harrington's investigation revealed Patey indeed stayed. Among remains found in the main cabin was a female skeleton with characteristics matching Patey's self. Descriptions: overlapping teeth, asymmetrical skull suggesting her wandering eye, joint abnormalities she mentioned. Tests later suggested she died sometime in late 1912 or early 1913, possibly from pneumonia or influenza, conditions her weakened body couldn't fight. The last Troxdale apparently died around 1914. The expedition found no evidence anyone lived in the valley after that date. An entire family line, stretching back to the 18th century, simply ceased to exist, consumed by genetic damage so severe it rendered them incapable of survival. Sheriff Burke reported his findings to county authorities, who dispatched additional teams to document the site. Physicians and scientists from universities in Kentucky and Tennessee traveled to the valley, studying remains and records. The Troxdale case became one of the most thoroughly documented examples of inbreeding consequences in American history. But the most important legacy was Patey's diary itself. Dr. Harrington ensured its preservation and later published it in medical journals. Though with names changed to protect the deceased, the diary became required reading in medical schools. A powerful illustration of genetic principles only beginning to be understood in the early 20th century. The story of Patey Troxdale and her family resonated far beyond eastern Kentucky's mountains. As Dr. Harrington shared findings with the medical community, the Troxdale case became a touchstone for discussions about genetics, heredity, and consequences of restricted breeding populations. Universities sent researchers studying the Troxdale compound over following years. They documented everything these skeletal remains, showing progressive deterioration across generations, family records revealing increasingly tangled bloodlines, physical evidence of a community destroying itself through self-imposed isolation. Research papers published from these studies helped establish foundational principles in emerging genetics. But scientific impact was only part of the story. Patey's diary, when finally published in accessible form in 1923, reached much broader audiences. Rural communities across Appalachia read it, recognizing warnings relevant to their own situations. Isolated farming communities in other parts of America saw parallels. The diary became a cautionary tale taught in schools, a powerful reminder why genetic diversity matters. Sheriff Clayton Burke spent remaining years working to identify other isolated mountain communities following similar patterns. He coordinated with physicians and social workers, reaching out to remote families, encouraging them to seek marriage partners outside immediate communities. His efforts helped prevent several potential situations from developing into tragedies like the Troxdale case. The mountain community near Harland never forgot the Troxdales. The valley where they lived remained abandoned, considered cursed by superstitious locals, but others recognized it as a memorial to hubris and isolation, a place demonstrating community connection and genetic diversity's importance. In 1953, the state of Kentucky placed a historical marker near the valley entrance, acknowledging what happened without sensationalizing tragedy. Dr. Samuel Harrington continued his rural Appalachian work for another 30 years. But the Troxdale case shaped everything he did afterward. He became an advocate for rural health education, ensuring isolated communities understood heredity basics and diverse family connections' importance. His Troxdale family papers remained influential in medical education well into the late 20th century. Scientific understanding emerging from Troxdale's study helped shape modern genetics. Researchers identified how recessive genes, normally hidden in diverse populations, became expressed when relatives married repeatedly across generations. They documented how small populations experienced rapid genetic decline. They demonstrated conclusively what many suspected: humans, like all sexually reproducing species, require genetic diversity, maintaining health across generations. But perhaps the most profound impact was how communities thought about themselves and their relationships. The Troxdale story became Appalachian culture, a story told around fires and dinner tables, a reminder that isolation and insularity taken to extremes lead to destruction. It reinforced traditional values about seeking spouses from neighboring communities, maintaining connections with wider world, dangers of believing your family alone possesses special virtue, requiring protection from outside influence. Patsey Troxdale's final wish, expressed in her diary, came true. Her words did reach the outside world. They did educate people about what happened when families closed themselves off too completely. And while quantifying how many potential tragedies were prevented by her testimony remains impossible, historical records suggest publicity around the Troxdale case changed behavior in isolated communities across rural America. The valley itself gradually returned to wilderness. Structures collapsed under weather and time. Trees grew through foundations. Vines covered what remained. Nature reclaimed the space where Troxdales tried creating their pure, isolated world. But lessons from that place lived on, preserved in Patey's diary and scientific studies conducted by Dr. Harrington and colleagues. In the 21st century, the Troxdale case remains relevant. Geneticists studying rare diseases reference it when explaining founder effects and genetic bottlenecks. Anthropologists cite it discussing cultural isolation risks. Historians use it illustrating rural American life during frontier to modern society transition. Medical ethicists point to it discussing informed consent importance and dangers of traditional practices, maintained without questioning. The story concludes not with triumph or redemption, but with quiet dignity of Patsey Troxdale's choice to stay with her suffering family and determination, leaving a record preventing future tragedies. Her voice, preserved in fading ink on yellowed pages, continues speaking across more than a century, reminding us silence protects no one. Isolation breeds suffering, and truth, no matter how painful, ultimately serves preventing future harm. If you made it to this moment, you understand why the Troxdale Diary mattered then and matters now. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss these forgotten histories shaping our understanding of genetics, family, and community. If you watched all the way through because you recognize preserving and learning from these difficult stories matters, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly values these deep dives into hidden American history. Hit the like button if this story impacted you and made you think differently about community connection and genetic diversity's importance. Share this video with anyone appreciating real history, the kind textbooks often skip, but teaching us most important lessons about human nature and consequences of our choices. The Troxdale story deserves remembering. By sharing it, you ensure Patty's sacrifice, documenting her family's tragedy, continues educating and warning future generations.